This war just moved into a far more dangerous phase, not because another missile was fired or because another airbase came under threat, but because one of the most important waterways on Earth is now sitting at the center of the crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a line on a map between Iran and the Gulf. It is becoming the point where a regional war can spill directly into the global economy, into oil markets, into shipping lanes, and into the political credibility of the United States and its allies. And that is what makes this moment different. This is not simply about who struck first or who responds next. It is about what happens when a war reaches the artery that helps keep the world's energy system moving. Because once Hormuz enters the story, the battlefield gets bigger than Iran, bigger than Israel, and bigger than Washington's immediate war aims. Roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil moves through this corridor, and the mere threat to that flow has already pushed prices sharply upward and raised fears of wider economic fallout. That means this is no longer a crisis that stays in military briefings and foreign ministry statements. It starts hitting insurance costs, shipping decisions, fuel prices, inflation expectations, and the nerves of governments that may not want any part of this war, but cannot ignore what happens if the strait stays under pressure. And this is where the story gets even more revealing. As the pressure around the strait rose, President Trump publicly pushed other countries to help secure it, calling on foreign governments to send warships and signaling frustration that support was not immediately materializing. But instead of a unified response, what emerged was hesitation, pushback, and in some cases, outright refusal. So in the middle of a fast-moving war, the world is now watching two crises develop at once: the fight over the Strait of Hormuz itself and the growing question of whether America can actually rally a coalition when the risks become real. That is the real threshold change. The strait is not just a choke point for oil, it is becoming a choke point for strategy, alliance politics, and global confidence. And if this pressure keeps widening, then the next chapter of this war may not be defined by one strike or one speech, but by what happens when the world discovers that reopening a vital waterway is easier to demand than to deliver. But that is where this story stops being only about geography and starts becoming a test of political power. Because once the Strait of Hormuz came under pressure, President Trump did not just talk about protecting shipping. He pushed America's allies to step in with military force. The message was blunt. If other countries depend on this waterway, then they should help defend it. And behind that demand was something even sharper: the suggestion that if allies refused to respond, it could have consequences for the future of NATO itself. That instantly changed the tone of the crisis. This was no longer just a naval security problem. It became a public stress test of alliance discipline in the middle of a war that many U.S. partners never wanted to own. What made the moment so striking was the contradiction inside it. Washington was talking as if a coalition should naturally form around reopening one of the world's most critical energy choke points. But the coalition was not actually there. Reporting around the crisis showed that a coordinated effort to protect oil tankers was still not ready, even as the pressure on shipping and energy markets kept building. So Trump's call carried an undertone of urgency and frustration. The United States was signaling that the threat was already serious, but the diplomatic and military structure needed to respond was still lagging behind the speed of the conflict itself. And this is why the demand mattered so much. It revealed that the battle over Hormuz was never just about escorting ships from one side of the Gulf to the other. It was about burden sharing, credibility, and whether America could still convert strategic dependence into allied action when the risks became immediate. Trump was effectively saying that countries benefiting from secure oil flows should stop acting like spectators. But that argument also exposed a deeper weakness. Many allies saw the danger in Hormuz, yet they did not want to be pulled into a U.S.-driven military response that could widen the war even further. So the very act of demanding support ended up revealing how thin the consensus really was. That is what makes this chapter so important in the larger story. Trump's demand was supposed to project resolve. Instead, it opened a second front in the crisis, not at sea, but across the alliance itself. Because once Washington publicly asks for warships and gets hesitation back, the issue is no longer only whether the Strait of Hormuz can be secured. The issue becomes whether the United States is leading a coalition or standing at the center of a widening conflict with fewer willing partners than it expected. And once that doubt enters the story, every next move becomes heavier, riskier, and more exposed. But this is where Washington ran into the hardest part of the story. Asking for Allied support is one thing. Getting it in the middle of a widening war is something very different. Almost immediately, the response from Europe made that clear. Germany flatly rejected the idea of joining military operations in the Strait of Hormuz during the conflict. British officials signaled that this would not be treated as a NATO mission. France also drew a firm line against taking part in operations to reopen the waterway by force. So instead of a visible coalition forming around the United States, what appeared was hesitation, distance, and a message that many allies did not want to militarily inherit a crisis they believed Washington had already helped escalate. And this is why the pushback matters far beyond the headlines. It tells you that even countries deeply dependent on stable energy flows, shipping security, and Gulf stability are still unwilling to translate that concern into warships on demand. In other words, the strategic logic is there, but the political consent is not. European governments can see the danger in leaving Hormuz contested. They can see the market shock. They can see the maritime risk. But they are also calculating something else. Once their forces enter that corridor under wartime conditions, the line between protecting trade and joining a broader confrontation with Iran becomes dangerously thin. That creates a very uncomfortable picture for Washington, because the U.S. argument sounds simple on the surface. Everyone benefits from open sea lanes, so everyone should help defend them. But allies are hearing a different message beneath it. They are hearing a request to absorb military risk after a war has already reached the point of threatening one of the world's most important choke points. And that changes the politics completely. What Trump presented as burden sharing, many partners appear to see as late-stage crisis outsourcing, a call to legitimize and support a military problem after the escalation has already happened. So this chapter is not really about a few governments saying no. It is about the shape of the coalition problem itself. The allies are not merely cautious. They are signaling that the crisis does not yet have a shared political foundation strong enough to support shared military action. And once that becomes visible, the whole story changes again. Because now the Strait of Hormuz is not just testing whether the West can keep oil moving. It is testing whether the United States can still turn strategic dependence into strategic obedience when the costs become immediate, visible, and potentially explosive. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. The Strait of Hormuz matters because this is not just a narrow passage between Iran and the Gulf. It is one of the world's most important energy choke points, a corridor through which about 1/5 of global oil shipments move. That means when this waterway comes under pressure, the consequences do not stay local for long. A military crisis in one stretch of sea suddenly becomes a pricing crisis, a shipping crisis, and a confidence crisis for governments and markets far beyond the Middle East. And this is why every new threat around Hormuz carries so much weight. You are not just talking about tankers being delayed. You are talking about insurance costs rising, shipping firms recalculating risk, importers bracing for supply disruption, and traders reacting to the possibility that a regional war could squeeze one of the arteries that feeds the global economy. That is why European leaders were discussing skyrocketing oil prices, even while rejecting direct military involvement, and why the pressure around the strait instantly became bigger than the war's original battlefield. The deeper danger is psychological as much as physical. Hormuz does not need to be permanently closed to trigger global stress. It only needs to look unstable enough that governments, companies, and markets begin pricing in the risk of something worse. Al Jazeera's reporting notes oil moving above $100 a barrel as the strait's closure fears intensified. Once that happens, this stops being a distant geopolitical confrontation and starts reaching ordinary people through fuel costs, transport costs, inflation pressure, and broader economic uncertainty. So this chapter is the hinge in the story, because once Hormuz is in play, the war is no longer measured only in missiles, drones, or naval maneuvers. It is measured in how quickly a strategic choke point can convert military escalation into global economic fear. And that is exactly why the next question is so dangerous. If everyone agrees the strait matters, why is there still so much resistance to defending it militarily? And this is where the pressure starts to widen, because the moment Trump linked support in the Strait of Hormuz to broader alliance expectations, the crisis stopped being just a shipping emergency and became a political test inside the Western Bloc itself. The message coming from Washington was not subtle. Countries that rely on secure energy flows and American protection should not stand back when one of the world's most critical sea lanes is under threat. But many allies did not accept that framing. They saw Hormuz as strategically important, yes, but they were far less willing to treat intervention there as an automatic alliance obligation. That gap is the NATO pressure point. What makes this so sensitive is that NATO was built as a defensive alliance for collective security in the Euro-Atlantic space, not as a blank check for every crisis Washington wants internationalized. So when British officials signaled this would not be a NATO mission, and Germany rejected joining military operations during the conflict, they were doing more than refusing a request. They were drawing a line around what the alliance is supposed to be. In effect, they were saying that protecting Hormuz may matter, but that does not automatically transform a U.S.-driven wartime naval response into a shared NATO duty. And once that line is drawn publicly, the alliance tension becomes impossible to hide. That is why this chapter matters so much in the larger script. The fight here is not only over ships, escorts, and sea lanes. It is over who gets to define the terms of Allied responsibility when a regional war begins to threaten global interests. Trump was trying to turn economic interdependence into military participation. European capitals were trying to separate the two. They wanted the strait open, oil flowing, and markets stable, but without stepping into a direct military role that could blur the line between defending trade and joining a broader confrontation with Iran. So the NATO pressure point is really a credibility test on both sides. For Washington, it raises the question of whether U.S. leadership still has the power to rally Allied action when the risks become immediate. For Europe, it raises the question of whether refusing participation protects strategic caution or simply exposes dependency without commitment. And that is what makes this so dangerous. Because once allies resist the political frame, the military problem does not disappear. It just becomes more unilateral, more improvised, and more likely to deepen the split at the exact moment the crisis is getting harder to contain. Say, write chapter 6 when you want the next chapter. Next sob gulawan buwan lik te tako. I'm finishing the remaining chapters in sequence now and tightening the flow so each one escalates naturally into the next without repeating the same point. And this is where the story becomes much more complicated than simple Allied reluctance. Europe is not indifferent to what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. Quite the opposite. European leaders know that if this waterway stays effectively shut or dangerously unstable, the economic damage will spread fast. Oil prices were already rising sharply, and EU officials openly warned that the situation was putting fresh pressure on energy markets. They also understood another uncomfortable reality. Higher oil prices do not just hurt consumers, they can also strengthen Russia's revenue position at a time when Europe is still deeply entangled in the Ukraine war. So Europe's dilemma is brutally simple. It wants the strait open. It wants the market shock contained. It does not want a prolonged maritime crisis. But it also does not want to be dragged into a U.S.-Israeli war on Iran that many European governments feel they were not properly consulted about in the first place. German officials made that frustration explicit, saying they needed clarity on U.S. and Israeli goals before moving to any next phase. Kaja Kallas said there was no appetite for extending the EU's Aspides mission to Hormuz, and her explanation was revealing. Nobody wanted to go actively into this war. That is what gives this chapter its strategic tension. Europe is caught between economic exposure and military caution. If it stays out, it risks appearing dependent on American protection without sharing the burden. If it goes in, it risks crossing the line from securing commerce to participating in escalation. And because neither option is comfortable, Europe is trying to hold on to a narrow middle position, support diplomacy, discuss maritime security later, and avoid being pulled into combat while the bombs are still falling. But that middle position is hard to hold when the crisis is moving faster than the diplomacy. Because once the waterway becomes the center of the war's economic fallout, waiting starts to look less like caution and more like paralysis. And that is exactly why the next layer of this story hits so hard. The oil shock is no longer a forecast. It is becoming part of the war itself. This is the point where the conflict stops feeling distant. The Strait of Hormuz carries about 1/5 of the world's oil shipments. And by March 16, reporting indicated prices had already surged past $100 a barrel as closure fears intensified. That kind of move is not just a market headline. It is the beginning of a chain reaction. Fuel becomes more expensive, shipping costs rise, insurance premiums climb, import-dependent economies start bracing for a broader inflation hit. And suddenly, a war centered in the Gulf begins reaching households and businesses far outside the Middle East. That is why Hormuz is such a dangerous pressure point. It compresses military escalation and economic shock into the same narrow strip of water. A missile exchange or naval standoff there does not remain a tactical event for very long. It becomes a pricing signal to global markets. It becomes a risk calculation for tanker firms. It becomes a political headache for governments already dealing with voter anger over affordability. The strait does not even need to be permanently sealed to trigger damage. It only needs to look unstable enough that the world starts paying for the possibility of worse. And that is what makes this layer so politically explosive for Washington as well. Trump is not just dealing with a wartime security problem, he is also staring at the domestic consequences of higher oil and fuel prices. The longer the strait remains contested and the longer allies hesitate, the harder it becomes to separate military strategy from economic pain. That is where geopolitical credibility starts colliding with kitchen table reality. So when people ask why the Strait of Hormuz matters, the answer is not simply that it moves oil. The answer is that it can turn a military crisis into an inflation crisis almost overnight. And once that happens, the war is no longer contained by geography. It enters the political bloodstream of multiple countries at once. Now look at the crisis from Iran's side, because this is where the pressure campaign becomes clearer. Tehran's leverage in Hormuz has never depended only on a formal declaration. Its power comes from the ability to make the strait feel unsafe, contested, and politically costly. Reporting from Fortune described Iranian messaging that some countries might still have access, while Trump's warships were getting no promises from key partners. That matters because it suggests the strait is being used not just as a military space, but as a political instrument, a way to shape who pays, who hesitates, and who breaks ranks under pressure. In other words, Iran does not need a perfectly sealed blockade to generate leverage. It needs enough disruption, enough ambiguity, and enough fear that global actors start arguing among themselves about who should respond and how far they are willing to go. And that is exactly what appears to be happening. Europe wants clarity, the US wants support. Tanker security is uncertain, markets are reacting, the coalition is not fully there. From Tehran's perspective, that kind of fragmentation can be strategically useful even before any final military outcome is decided. That is why Hormuz is such a potent signal platform for Iran. It communicates that the war can be widened economically, even if it is not widened territorially in the most obvious way. It tells outside powers that there is a cost to military pressure, and that the cost can be distributed unevenly across markets, alliances, and public opinion. And once that signal starts working, the conflict becomes harder to frame as a straightforward problem of naval security alone. So the Iranian message here is not subtle. If the war continues, the consequences will not stay confined to strike sites and air defenses. They will move into trade routes, fuel prices, alliance politics, and strategic patience. And that is why the next question becomes so dangerous. What happens when every side starts feeling pressure, but no side wants to be the one seen backing down? Because once that happens, the story is no longer contained. If allies keep refusing, if the coalition remains incomplete, and if the strait stays unstable, the pressure on Washington grows in only one direction, toward more unilateral action, more improvisation, and more risk. Reuters and other reporting make clear that major partners such as France, Germany, and Poland have resisted direct participation, while others want more clarity before even considering support. That means the military problem does not disappear. It simply becomes more concentrated on the United States and a small number of willing actors. And unilateral crisis management in a place like Hormuz is inherently dangerous. The waterway is narrow, crowded, symbolically charged, and tied directly to global energy flows. Any operation to escort ships, suppress threats, or reopen transit under wartime conditions carries the risk of miscalculation. A single incident at sea can trigger a much wider spiral when both sides are already operating under political and military pressure. That is why even countries rejecting involvement are not relaxed about the situation. They understand that the absence of a broad coalition does not reduce danger. It may actually increase it. There is also a second contagion effect here: diplomatic fragmentation. Once the U.S. starts publicly measuring Allied enthusiasm and hinting that it matters for the future of NATO, the Hormuz crisis begins corroding trust inside the alliance itself. At that point, the conflict spreads not only across the region, but across Western political relationships. Now the war is testing naval capacity, alliance unity, energy resilience, and diplomatic coordination at the same time. That is a much larger and more unstable crisis than a simple shipping dispute. So this chapter is really about escalation by pressure. No one may want the war to widen further, but if the strait remains contested, if oil stays elevated, and if the political response stays fractured, then widening becomes less a deliberate choice and more the path the crisis keeps pushing everyone toward. So what happens next? The most likely short-term reality is not a clean resolution, but an awkward and dangerous holding pattern. Washington will keep trying to build support, even if that support comes in partial or indirect forms rather than a full allied naval coalition. Some governments may be willing to discuss post-hostilities escort arrangements or non-combat maritime roles. But the current reporting shows very little appetite for joining active wartime operations in Hormuz while the fighting continues. That means the next phase of the crisis may hinge on a narrow set of questions. Can the U.S. stabilize tanker traffic without broad Allied backing? Can Europe keep the distance it wants without paying a larger economic price? Can Iran maintain pressure without provoking an even bigger military response? And can any side create an off-ramp before the economic shock starts forcing harder decisions? None of those questions has an easy answer right now, and that uncertainty is the story. The deeper point is this: the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a side theater in a larger war. It has become the place where military escalation, alliance credibility, and global economic risk all collide. If Washington finds a way to reopen confidence in the waterway, it will look like a demonstration of control under pressure. If it does not, then the crisis will stand as proof that even the world's most important alliances can hesitate when the cost of action becomes immediate and the strategic ownership of the war is disputed. And that is the final takeaway. The most dangerous part of this story may not be the first strike, the latest threat, or even the current standoff itself. It may be the vacuum opening around it, a gap between what the world needs from Hormuz, what Washington expects from its allies, and what those allies are actually prepared to do. Because once that gap becomes visible, the crisis stops looking temporary. It starts looking like the beginning of a much larger test of power, trust, and global stability.